Here we go again. Another state is embarking on a treaty process with Indigenous Australians. This time, it's New South Wales. And even though the overwhelming majority of Australians voted against the voice, and therefore voted against a treaty idea, states are still going ahead with it. Literally every state in Australia voted against the voice, by margins in the vicinity of 60% to 40%. Australians don't want this. And let's be clear, the voice is in fact less bad than a treaty would be. The voice conveys a risk, a possibility of financial repercussions, things such as reparations and the like. Whereas a treaty involves the certainty of that occurring. A treaty is worse than the voice. And therefore, if people were voting against the voice, it is certain they would vote against the treaty. And indeed, there might be some people who would vote for a voice, but not for a treaty. As such, one would think the proportion of people voting against a treaty would be significantly higher than 60%. But that hasn't stopped politicians from pursuing these harebrained ideas. Like I've said, New South Wales is the latest one to do so, embarking on a years-long treaty listening tour, costing many millions of dollars. But of course, who do you think they're actually listening to? Do you think they're asking or listening to no voters? Do you think they're asking or listening to everyday Australians? Do you think they're asking or listening to the majority of Australians that voted against the voice? No, it is very clear they're only listening to people who want a treaty. They're only listening to the people they want to listen to. They're only going to listen to Indigenous activists, people like Megan Davis in New South Wales or Marshall Langton in Victoria. They're only listening to the people that are telling them what they want to hear. The obvious problem, of course, is that around 60% of New South Wales voters voted against the voice, much like in every other state. The only areas in New South Wales that voted for the voice were the inner city electorates, and even then, it wasn't by a significant margin. This suggests that there's really no overwhelming support for something like a treaty. There's almost literally no electorate that actually really wants this, and the only electorates that want it are in inner city locations. And the problem with a treaty is obviously that it is going to involve financial costs. After all, if there's a treaty, that treaty has to contain contents, and therefore one would presumably be giving something to Indigenous Australians as part of that treaty. That could be, for example, a proportion of rents from natural resources, a proportion, for example, of mining royalties. Or it could be things such as exemptions from land tax, or it could be other financial settlements in the form of reparations. It is very clear there is going to be a financial cost that non-Indigenous Australians happen to bear. That is obviously what is going to happen. And anyone who says otherwise is simply trying to pull the wool over your eyes. They would simply be spreading so-called misinformation, so to speak. Indeed, one would think the government, when they're going through the sales pitch for this, should themselves look in the mirror and ask themselves, who is spreading misinformation here? Because in reality, it is them. It would be the person looking themselves in the mirror when the Premier does so. In essence, the government is going to try to hoodwink voters into going along with this whole situation. But of course, if the government is being in any way fair about this, in any way honest, they would of course put this treaty to a plebiscite or a referendum. After all, if they're so confident that people want this, maybe they should let people vote on it. But of course, we all know they aren't going to do this. We all know that the state governments are going to try to ram this through their state parliaments. And in many cases in state governments, because it is a bit of a trash fire as it comes to state politics, it's often the case that a state government can ram through things through Parliament whenever it wants to do so. Just look at Victoria. Part of the problem with this, of course, is that people aren't paying a ton of attention to state politics. Furthermore, the state opposition often doesn't get very much airtime, it doesn't get very much coverage in the media, and therefore people often don't even know who the opposition leader is, let alone what their stance is. And therefore, many of these policies just get flagged through. And I fear that is what is likely to happen. And I also fear that when it comes to the next election, there won't be any consequences for this. People will just vote in the same clowns, even though they just go and do things like this. In some ways, I don't have that much sympathy for voters who vote for these trash policies and then are saddled with them. I do, however, have sympathy for the people who don't want this trash and are still lumped with it. Now, of course, this shows a whole lot of problems, chief amongst which is what I've referred to in the past as being an agency conflict. We, the voters, are hiring politicians to work on our behalf. But they aren't really doing that, because they're incentivized to just get re-elected. And in so doing, what do? Well, they shift money from one group of people to another group of people. They shift money from the voter bloc they don't think will give them votes to the voter bloc that will give them votes. And this can involve seizing assets and resources from a minority of the population to give to a numerical majority. It might be normatively and morally bankrupt, but they would do so anyway because it will get them re-elected. Similarly, when it comes to things such as the treaty, they might go and pursue things like this just because they happen to feel as if it benefits them, either electorally or in terms of benefiting them at the trendy parties they might be going along to, benefiting them with their own other inner city people they are associating with. It is clear they are doing this for their benefit, not for voters' benefits. And that really underscores almost all of the policies that many politicians are bringing in. They're bringing it in for their own benefit, not for the benefit of any other individual Australian. Furthermore, often when they're selling these things, they outright lie to you. We saw this all the time with the Voice referendum. We saw this all the time where Anthony Albanese would pretend that a Voice was just a modest proposal, an advisory group that would provide advice and recommendations to Parliament, and it therefore wouldn't have any real power. Of course, Anthony Albanese was clearly misleading people, because the Voice would be the only constitutionally enshrined body that would have funding, and the only one that would have guaranteed access to the executive and to Parliament, and therefore the only group that would have guaranteed abilities to make representations and to be asked to make representations in relation to policies, because the right to make representations implies the right to be informed and given the opportunity to make those representations. As a result, the Voice body would have had real power. Anthony Albanese was misleading people when he said otherwise. And therefore, we can see exactly how politicians are acting in this context. They go out of their way to mislead and misinform people. And they're doing it the same here. They're doing it with their treaty in New South Wales. We've seen this, of course, with Victoria, where they've pursued the same idea. And in Victoria, there was a proposal that Indigenous Australians would get a proportion of mining royalties, as an example. We've seen this in Queensland, where treaties were forecast to cost many, many millions of dollars. And who pays the money? It isn't the politicians. It is the taxpayers. It is the citizens. And it is the people who aren't actually given a direct vote on any of this. Because I dare say a treaty would be defeated by even greater margin than the Voice. But of course, that type of thing will never happen. And the politicians will keep pursuing these harebrained schemes. Keep pursuing it because they feel as if they may get re-elected in their own electorate, or more likely, it is going to make them feel better when they show up to the next trendy party or show up to the next art gallery, and they can hobnob with all of the other people that believe the same thing as they do in their groupthink insular environment. In essence, they are treating voters as mugs, and they're just doing whatever they want anyway. The treaty is perhaps the biggest paradigm example of that type of thing. And this, of course, is going to cost us money, because it will involve financial transfers, obviously. It will involve either direct reparations, so to speak, or indirect reparations. Either way, it's going to cost money. And that money is going to come from taxpayers. That is obvious. And there's no way of getting around that. These treaties need to be stopped. I dare say voters need to send a clear message to the state government that they will vote against the state government and vote against their representatives in the next election if they don't stop doing these stupid policies. But of course, let me know your thoughts about the idea of a treaty at state level in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear whether you happen to agree with these politicians or whether you think they're exceeding their mandate. Let me know what you think.